For decades now, farmers and ranchers have struggled to control the rising population of destructive and dangerous feral hogs.
For years, wildlife biologists working across the American South had grown used to a grim, repeating story. Feral hog numbers kept climbing no matter what anyone tried, and the land kept paying for it. So when a routine camera trap survey in the Texas Hill Country started returning footage that nobody on the research team could immediately explain, the reaction wasn't excitement. It was caution. The cameras were left running, the site was kept quiet, and for a short window, almost nobody outside the survey crew was told what was on the memory cards. Not because the footage showed something dangerous to people. It showed something that could vanish the moment word got out and hunters, trappers, or curious landowners came looking for it. What those cameras had captured, and what a slow, patient accumulation of scat samples and stomach content studies would later confirm, was one of the strangest and most quietly consequential wildlife stories of the last 20 years. An ordinary American predator, the coyote, had started hunting the piglets of the single most destructive invasive species in the country. And in doing so, it had become something close to the only real check on a population that every government program, every bounty, and every hunter with a rifle had failed to control. The feral hog crisis in the United States has a strange origin story, because it didn't start with an accident of nature. It started with people. In the 1500s, Spanish explorers moving along the Gulf Coast released domestic pigs as a portable food source, animals that could be left to forage and later collected for meat. Some of those pigs were never collected. They wandered off, adapted to the wild, and quietly persisted for centuries as free-ranging swine scattered across the South. That alone might have stayed a minor, manageable nuisance. What turned it into a crisis was a second wave of introductions in the early 20th century, when Eurasian wild boar were imported into parts of the South specifically for hunting estates. These weren't soft, domesticated animals. Eurasian boar are lean, aggressive, and built for survival in landscapes with real predators. When escaped or released boar interbred with the descendants of those old Spanish pigs, the result was a hybrid animal combining a domestic pig's fast, prolific breeding with a wild boar's toughness, speed, and wariness. That hybrid is essentially what people mean today when they say feral hog. The math behind their spread is genuinely staggering. A single sow can produce 2 litters a year, with as many as 10 to 12 piglets per litter, and under good conditions, a local population can double in as little as 4 months. Multiply that across a landscape with few natural predators, and you get exponential growth that outpaces almost anything short of catastrophic disease. Current USDA estimates put the national feral hog population somewhere between 6 and 9 million animals, present in at least 35 states and expanding into new territory every year. Texas alone is thought to hold more feral hogs than any other state, with the animals now found on the overwhelming majority of the state's farms. The damage that population inflicts is not abstract. The most detailed recent economic assessment, compiled by USDA's National Feral Swine Damage Management Program together with the National Wildlife Research Center and the National Agricultural Statistics Service, put total annual losses to U.S. agriculture at roughly $1.6 billion. That figure includes direct crop losses, pasture land degradation, damaged fencing and irrigation infrastructure, lost income from farmers changing what and where they plant just to avoid hog damage, and the labor and money spent on control efforts that often produce only temporary relief. Texas alone accounts for more than half of that national total, with estimated annual damages approaching $900 million. Older, broader estimates that include non-agricultural damage, water and soil contamination, and disease costs have put the true nationwide toll closer to $2.5 billion a year. Feral hogs earn that price tag honestly. A rooting sounder can strip a cornfield down to bare, churned earth in a single overnight visit. Their wallowing behavior, driven by the fact that pigs lack functional sweat glands and rely on mud and water to regulate body temperature, concentrates waste and sediment directly into streams and ponds, degrading water quality in ways that are measurable downstream. They carry more than 24 documented diseases and parasites, including pseudorabies and swine brucellosis, some of which can spread to livestock, pets, and in rare cases, to people who handle carcasses without protection. And while attacks on humans are uncommon, they are not unheard of. In 2019, an elderly woman in southeast Texas was killed by feral hogs outside the home where she worked as a caregiver, a case that briefly made national news and reminded a lot of people that these are not harmless barnyard escapees. If you're hearing all this for the first time, the obvious question is why the country doesn't just eat its way out of the problem. Millions of wild pigs, a genuine appetite in American food culture for pork. And yet almost none of that meat legally reaches a grocery store shelf. The reasons turn out to be more complicated than simple squeamishness. The first barrier is disease. Feral hogs carry meaningfully higher rates of parasites and pathogens than farm-raised pigs, and a real share of tested populations come back positive for brucellosis or pseudorabies exposure. That doesn't make the meat automatically dangerous if it's properly cooked, but it does make large-scale, informal harvesting a genuine health liability, especially for the people doing the field dressing. The second barrier is regulatory. Federal law requires that any meat sold commercially be processed in a USDA-inspected facility, and building out a reliable, economically viable supply chain to trap, transport, and process wild-caught hogs at scale, one that can guarantee consistent sourcing and safety testing, has never attracted enough investment to get off the ground nationally, even though small regional wild boar processing operations do exist. The third barrier is simply taste and market appetite. Wild hogs that have spent their lives foraging on roots, carrion, and whatever they can root up are leaner, tougher, and more strongly flavored than a corn-fed farm pig. And while wild boar is a genuine culinary tradition in parts of Europe, it has never developed the same mainstream demand in the United States. Put those three things together, and you get an animal that is abundant, destructive, and edible in principle, but essentially untouched as a large-scale food source. For decades, the default response to rising hog numbers was more of the same: cage traps, bounty hunts, organized shoots, and increasingly, aerial gunning from helicopters over large tracts of land. All of these methods work in the narrow sense that they kill hogs. None of them, used alone, has ever come close to reversing the overall population trend, and researchers who study the problem have been fairly candid about why. Hogs are smart, social animals, and they learn from every encounter that doesn't kill them. Partial trap captures teach survivors to avoid that trap, and in some cases, that behavior appears to spread through the group. Ground hunting with dogs is exhausting, expensive, and dangerous, since a sow defending piglets will readily charge and injure hunting dogs. And because reproduction is so fast, removing even a large fraction of a local population in one season does little if the survivors simply rebuild the numbers before the next breeding cycle. Wildlife managers have described the dynamic as something close to bailing out a boat with a hole still in the hull. You can work as hard as you want, but unless something changes the rate the water is coming in, you're not gaining ground. That frustration is what makes the Coyote story so significant. It wasn't a tool anyone built. It was a shift in animal behavior that had been quietly happening in the background the whole time, largely unnoticed, until camera traps and diet studies started to pick it up. Beginning around the early 2010s, wildlife researchers working in Texas started noticing something unusual showing up in coyote diet studies: piglet remains, in quantities too large to explain as occasional scavenging. Follow-up work in Texas and Georgia found that feral hog material, much of it from young piglets, made up close to a third of the diet in some sampled coyote populations, a striking figure for an animal usually associated with rodents, rabbits, and carrion. Camera trap footage from several of these study sites added detail to the numbers. Researchers documented coyotes approaching hog bedding sites cautiously, often from downwind, and appearing to time their approach to windows when an adult sow had briefly left a nest of piglets to forage. Because a nursing sow is the only real defense a litter of piglets has, and because she is far more dangerous to a coyote than the piglets themselves, successful attempts tended to be quick, opportunistic, and focused on isolated or unattended young rather than direct confrontation with a defending adult. It's worth being careful about how far the evidence actually goes here, because the scientific picture is more nuanced than a single dramatic narrative. Some of the diet studies, going back to earlier work in places like the Savannah River site in South Carolina and in Mississippi, found that hog remains in coyote scat tended to spike during and after human hunting and trapping operations, which strongly suggests at least some of that hog consumption is scavenging on carcasses left behind by hunters and control programs, not fresh predation. Wildlife agencies like Texas Parks and Wildlife have been fairly measured on this point, noting that where large predators, such as mountain lions, black bears, or alligators overlap with hog populations, meaningful predation on hogs does occur, but that for coyotes specifically the picture is mixed, and that predation of any kind still plays a comparatively minor role in